Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful and scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Kimberly K. Hoang as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Kimberly K. Hoang is a professor of sociology at the University of Chicago, whose work illuminates the hidden architectures of global capitalism. Her research explores how deals are made in frontier and emerging economies, revealing the social networks, informal practices, and power dynamics that shape the movement of capital across borders. She is the author of two award-winning books, Spiderweb Capitalism, How Global Allied Exploits Frontier Markets, published by Princeton University Press in 2020, offers a rare behind-the-scenes account of how global allied use offshore structures and intricate professional network to conceal and multiply wealth. Drawing on extensive interviews, the book exposes often invisible ecosystem of lawyers, accountants, and intermediaries who facilitate these financial flows. It has received five major awards from the Association of American Publishers and the American Sociological Association. Her earlier book, Dealing in Desire, Asian Exandy, Western Decline, and the Hidden of Currencies in Global Sex Work, examines the intersection of intimacy, finance, and power in Vietnam's informal economy. Through deeply immersive ethnography, Dr. Hoang uncovers how relationships between sex workers and clients are intertwined with global financial transactions and shifting geopolitical identities. The book has been recognized with seven prestigious awards across leading academic associations. Professor Wong's broader body of work spans top-tier journals including American Sociological Review, Social Problems, Gender and Society, and Sociological Theory, among others. Her articles have garnered more than 14 awards and honors across multiple sections of the American Sociological Association and allied scholarly groups. In recognition of her intellectual leadership, she received the 2020 Lewis A. Coser Award for theoretical agenda setting from the American Sociological Association. She is also a celebrated educator honored with the University of Chicago's Quantrill Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching in 2018. Across her research and teaching, Dr. Hoang brings into focus the often unseen human and institutional network that drives global markets, revealing not just how capitalism operates, but who make it possible. In today's episode, Professor Kimberly K. Hoang shares key insights from her prominent book, Spiderweb Capitalism, How Global Elites Exploit Frontier Markets. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kimberly K. Hoang to the conversation. Professor Kimberly, it's a distinct privilege to host you today at Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Professor, the term Spiderweb Capitalism is striking. How did you arrive at this metaphor? And what does it capture the traditional views of global capitalism miss?
Yeah. The metaphor captures what I would say asymmetry, which is there is a small number, as I write about it in the book, of dominant spiders, otherwise known as ultra high net worth individuals, that sit at the center of these layers, and then there are intermediaries that construct and maintain the parts of the web, and those are high net worth individuals. Um, I think that traditional sort of globalization narratives imagine that there are transparent flows between nation states. And this framework, Spiderweb Capitalism, instead emphasizes the hidden infrastructure that's sort of like visible, invisible, that operates across different sovereignties. So the web is intentionally difficult to map, and that's part of what I outline because they use shell companies, offshore holding structures, nominees. These are individuals who own the company on paper but don't actually substantively have substantive ownership. They're lawyers, accountants, and fixers, and there are these fragmented knowledge systems. So the metaphor highlights this tension between fragility and control, that when you think of a spider web, and webs are also adaptive, sticky, difficult to unravel once they're established. I would say a key intervention is that capitalism today is not organized through firms or states, but spiderweb capitalism articulates how it's layered through architectures that span multiple places, like the Cayman Islands, Seychelles, British Virgin Islands, to Singapore, Hong Kong, and in my case, Vietnam and Myanmar. So the web, in some ways, supersedes the nation state as an organizing unit of global capitalism and thinks about capital flows across multiple sovereigns.
Professor, research takes us inside a world that is deliberately opaque. What was the most surprising or counterintuitive insight you uncovered while interviewing across within this system?
I think that, part of what I found most interesting that I uncovered is the fact that this is so mundane. When the Panama Papers was leaked, people thought that this was, famous people or government, like well-known government officials or ultra wealthy individuals that are engaged in these practices. And I think the thing that I found that was the most surprising was the banality, mundane aspect of this, that in fact, this was not about like individual villains that we're trying to uncover, but it was a system story. And I guess what I would say is that a story about a system is less sexy than a story about individual villains or heroes, right? That you've uncovered, you can point to, but the sort of like banality, mundane aspect of these structures, I thought was very, very surprising.
Professor described a vast network of intermediaries, lawyers, accountants, fixers, who enable these financial flows. How do these actors justify their roles within ethically gray or questionable systems?
Yeah, I would say that um, the core way that I think about this is that there was this moral reasoning inside of gray systems. So many intermediaries view themselves, using professional standards as service professionals, not necessarily as political actors. So lawyers and accountants often frame their work in this as risk management or regulatory navigation or efficiency creation. And there's a strong discourse that everybody does this. This is how business works, right? That like, and I think the other thing that I think is very interesting is that they simply structure deals that are legal, right? These are all legal structures or operating within the purview of the law. And so participants often describe the difference between or distinguish between dirty corruption and what they would otherwise say as like necessary relationship management, right? Particularly in frontier and emerging markets where there's not a lot of access to information, where relationships matter a great deal. So the book shows how people construct what I call moral regimes of justification, right? To reconcile the ethical ambiguity with the professional ambitions that they have. And many of the actors externalize personal responsibility or accountability, right? That like there's no one person that feels accountable for the full consequences of a system. And that goes back to what I said earlier of this being a system story.
Professor, the book traces capital from offshore jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands to frontier markets such as Vietnam and Myanmar. Why are these particular geographies so central to the functioning of the system?
Yeah, so I mean, spiderweb capitalism, as I theorize and build the concept, one of the key arguments that I make is geography is a core part of the infrastructure. And so offshore jurisdictions are not peripheral, they are actually central command nodes to global capitalism. And this is very different from the way that Saskia Sassen conceived of global cities. We often thought of global cities as a nation states first or global cities as central nodes. And what I argue is that places like the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands provide secrecy, tax advantages, asset shielding, legal flexibility. And Singapore and Hong Kong then function as intermediary financial hubs partly because they're politically stable, they're globally connected, and they're places that are trusted by investors. Then when you go down in terms of the webs, like the architecture of the webs, Vietnam and Myanmar represent what I call frontier markets. Many people characterize these as frontier markets. So it's like, how do you connect developed economies to frontier economies? And frontier markets are rapidly growing, unregulated, politically fluid. They're full of arbitrage opportunities, right? And so these geographies work together in this layered ecosystem of offshore entities and holding companies that operate as offshore companies. So frontier markets become especially attractive precisely because the rules are unsettled and the relationships can substitute formal institutions, but they always are connected back through paper companies set up in these offshore jurisdictions.
Professor, many of these practices operate in space between legal and illegal. How do global elites exploit this ambiguity, and who ultimately defines where that line is drawn?
Yeah. I mean, this is the Moneyball question, I would say. The other core concept of like sort of what is a process that enables the building of the structure that I refer to as spiderweb capitalism? What are the strategies? The primary one, as they articulate it, is playing in the gray. So what that means is that this is a system that thrives on ambiguity, right? One of the book's central arguments is that the illicit and licit, or this gray space, playing in this gray space, are co-constitutive of one another. So global elites exploit the differences between these legal systems, these tax regimes, these anti-corruption standards, these regulatory standards, and offshore structures create this distance between ownership, accountability, and liability, right? So playing in the gray means operating in spaces where legality is flexible, where enforcement is selective. Enforcement is selective in, markets where relationships matter, and where the moral norms vary from one jurisdiction to another. So the line between legal and illegal is often defined less by principle, and more by political power or jurisdictional reach, or who has access to the resources to structure these transactions properly. I guess I would say a major takeaway from this gray zone between legal and illegal is that corruption is not necessarily simply a failure of capitalism, but it's frequently embedded within how global markets operate.
Professor, you conducted hundreds of interviews across continents. Were there moments where your access to this hidden world changed your own assumptions about wealth, power, and legitimacy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think that, when I started this project, I had a really hard time um, understanding elite. So at the time, we often thought of like the 1% and the 99%. And with rising global inequality, it's easy to villainize the 1% as inequality gets wider and wider. What I think was surprising is that there was a big difference between the 0.01% and the bottom part of the 1%. And I think my book really focuses on that division at the top. And I think one of the things that was surprising to me was the way in which those who are not part of the 0.01%, right? The top, the bottom of that 1% feel economically precarious. And part of the feeling of economic precariousness is that they can see inequality growing wider, and feel that at any moment they can slip and fall, and that, the cost of living, the cost of groceries, the cost of childcare, the cost of healthcare if you live in the United States, all of those things are just increasing in cost, and what they make isn't worth it. So I think of the C-suite executives that run many of these deals that are the front person for the ultra high net worth individuals, as an example. I think what was surprising to me in getting having a more personal conversation with them, or getting to know, interviewing them more intimately, is just how precarious they too feel.
Professor, frontier markets are often portrayed as a high risk and high reward environments. What makes them so attractive to global capital despite political instability and regulatory uncertainty?
Yeah, this is the main puzzle of the book, right? I mean, traditional economics would lead us to believe that money flows to developed economies because they have clear rule of law, strong institutions, greater transparency. And the puzzle of this book is why is there so much money flooding into markets that are characterized by widespread corruption, low transparency, weak states, limited access to information, right? And I think the key takeaway here is that risk becomes profitable, right? Frontier markets offer opportunities that are unavailable in mature economies precisely because there's weak regulation, sort of rapidly appreciating assets, right? The potential return on investment is much larger. Privatization, most important, insider access, access to deals that are not available on the public market, and in this case, in these contexts, political leverage. So investors are not entering are entering not despite instability, but actually because of it. And I think that's really key in the story here. What political uncertainty does is it creates opportunities for discounted assets, um, monopolistic advantages, early positioning before there's like institutional consolidation or before the state knows how to. I have this term in the book called front running. It's like you're front running systems and laws, right? Where before the state has had built the capacity to regulate, you're kind of like have first movers advantage. And so the key currency often in these contexts is relational. It's proximity to political elites, and it's not necessarily market transparency or clear governance. And investors use offshore structures to insulate themselves if things collapse. So, like if deals fail in Vietnam and Myanmar, losses can be contained within a specific offshore shell structure that sort of like creates these legal firewalls between one investment and the next.
Professor, how do local economies and societies in places like Vietnam experience or absorb these flows of offshore capital? Who benefits and who is left out?
I mean, I think this is a really challenging question in part because it's virtually impossible to identify and quantify, right? I mean, like leading economists have had a very hard time, um, uh, like quantifying the tax losses. I mean, Gabriel Zuckman's book, Hidden Wealth of Nations, gets the closest to this. But I think a big piece of it is what we're seeing is an explosion in the news of, so in the case of 1MDB, as an example, $12 billion of Malaysian public pension funds were siphoned off into the personal bank accounts of its former Prime Minister Najib Razak and its Malaysian financier Joe Low. And by the way, Joe Low is somewhere in the world, he's hiding somewhere. And so, and then, in the case of Vietnam that I study, there was a $44 billion fraud scheme of a wealthy Vietnamese businesswoman that consolidated three cash-strapped banks into one bank called Saigon Commercial. And through hundreds of shell companies, she sort of like had friends and family give loans to herself offshore. And the number in the news is that $44 billion was moved out through these offshore shell companies. So what that means is that the local economies are missing out on, we think of trickle down economics, right? We think like when foreign investment moves into a country, many people benefit because, this is good for everybody. Things may be unequal for a while, and there's lots of ways that this is contested, I'll just say. But one way is, well, it doesn't really trickle down if the money has been taken out. Um,
Professor, there is a moral tension running through the book between opportunity, ambition, and exploitation. Did you find that individuals within this system see themselves as a complicit or simply as a participants in a normalized global structure?
I think that people are complex and people are multidimensional. And I think people have what I would say a moral regime of justification, right? A continuum on which they make decisions. And part of it is, many of these countries have experienced deep economic insecurity, famine, precarity. And so many of these people locally think about this as, securing their future, their family's future, and think, and it's coming more from a fear of scarcity, right? On the other hand, there are those that certainly play more towards the black of the gray and, articulate this as, it's just like outright theft and fraud, right? And I think it's egregious and they kind of get away with it. And that's the continuum. And I think people make sense of themselves in that space along the continuum. One of many of my respondents call this an ultimate family sacrifice. It's something that they're doing to secure their families in multiple generations. Other people say, what I do in frontier markets is like siphon off there and I live this other moral life, high life with my family in, North America. So I think everybody sort of comes to it in different ways.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. In the wake of leaks like the Panama Papers, there is a greater public awareness of offshore finance. Do you think transparency is improving, or has the system simply evolved to become more sophisticated and harder to trace?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm part of a group of offshoring scholars or scholars who are experts on offshoring. And I think that even among us, there's debate. Some people would say that there's greater transparency, that the Panama Papers dramatically increased awareness of offshore finance and revealed how deeply embedded these systems are within global capitalism. I mean, governments, journalists, and watchdog organizations now have far more data to work with in the Panama Papers leak. There's greater public attention and interest, and there's stronger international coordination tools. So the ICIJ leak, the International for the Consortium of Journalists, for example, these are like hundreds of journalists around the world that coordinated there. There's, I think, also greater transparency in one jurisdiction pushes activity into new intermediaries. So on the other hand, I do think it's gotten more layered and sophisticated in that there's more layered ownership chain. So, what I uncovered for Spiderweb Capitalism, I think those ownership structures have gotten even more complex, that the people themselves, they're legally dense and hard to figure out. There are more private investment vehicles, trusts, family offices that have emerged. If we just look at the data of the number of family offices and like the growth of that profession over time, and emerging offshore financial centers. So on the one hand, yes, there's greater transparency. On the other hand, I think technological and financial innovation have also made the structures more sophisticated and transnational. And I think another challenge is that transparency itself is uneven. So wealthy actors can afford the elite legal expertise and regulatory arbitrage in ways that ordinary citizens just can't simply afford, right? I think the core issue is not just secrecy, but fragmentation. So information is not distributed evenly across jurisdictions or institutions, and service professionals, do various things in different jurisdictions. So I think while the public knows more than a decade ago, tracing ownership and accountability remains extraordinarily difficult. And that was like the greatest challenge of this book. And I would just say that, like, to conclude, the persistence of offshore systems suggests this is not merely regulatory failure. Because if it was regulatory failure, we wouldn't have these systems after the leak, right? But actually, the extent to which modern global capitalism depends on legal ambiguity, mobility, and differentiated sovereignty.
Thank you, Professor Hoang, for taking us inside a world that is often hidden in plain sight. Your insights into the networks, moral complexities, and global flows of capital truly challenge how we understand modern economies. And thank you to our listeners for joining us this thought-provoking conversation. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning what lies beneath the surface. Thank you once again, Professor Kimberly Hoang, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today.